Hello everybody, welcome to episode 54 of Life and Life Only, and this is the third part of 3 of the series on propaganda, mostly using the book Propaganda, Power and Persuasion by David Welch. If this goes 3 hours, then I guess I'll do part 3.5 out of 3, or part 4 out of 3. I probably will have to scoot through the rest of this book to some extent. And as you probably heard, if you've heard the first 2 parts, there is some repetition. I'm trying not to repeat myself, but similar points are coming up, basically. Now, the next chapter is quite unique, really. This is called Propaganda as Public Information. Now, this chapter of the book is basically all positive, and it's all to do with propagandizing the public regarding things like vaccinations against diseases, healthy eating and exercise, those kind of things. Now, some of you in England might be thinking, yeah, right, we remember 5 a day. That was the idea that every adult needed 5 portions of fruit or vegetables a day. But then in some schools, chips, French fries, because they are something to do with potatoes. They were used as some of the 5 a day. I even saw 5 a day on vending machines that were selling fruit drinks, such as orange juice, which is just absolutely loaded with sugar. But be that as it may, this is really the chapter where the word propaganda is very questionable. But, I mean, it's still a very interesting chapter. I wonder, I'd say it's probably perhaps more persuasion than propaganda, but as we've seen, remember, persuasion was one of the synonyms we mentioned right at the beginning that has a strong connection with propaganda. So they talk about campaigns can be traced back to Britain's Public Health Act of 1848, and today they are a global phenomenon. They're talking about the promotion of public health, basically. Another thing I did want to mention, just straight off the bat here, as I have nuanced my view of the world, I've started to distance myself away from the idea that governments never care about citizens and politicians are this evil force that are only ever career-minded and never care about the public. We can argue about why people become politicians. Some people become politicians because it's in their family. Some people perhaps do cynically just see it as a position where in their minds, they don't have to work too hard, and it's a position of prestige. There's a thing called career politicians. I don't think that phrase really used to exist. I don't think people thought of politicians like that, but over time that has been the case. And then there are ones that just want to do good, and perhaps they start in local government. I always say that as you move up what's called the greasy pole, and you realise how corrupt it all is, there are certain points where you can stay at the level you're at or get out the game completely. But I think it's a little bit naive and a little bit too cynical to just say governments always lie and politicians never care. I just don't think that's the case. You'll probably find the people that have made it to the top largely have made it there for various skills other than caring about the public. So here's a section on healthy eating. The relationship between personal health and the health of the nation was a subject of much public debate in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was a particular concern of the great imperial powers, anxious to maintain their positions in the world. Some argued that to fundamentally improve the health of a population, intervention was needed at a biological level. Francis Galton's research in the 1860s, what became known as eugenics, described the application of the emerging scientific understanding of genetics. The aim was to encourage the breeding of those deemed worthy of reproducing and to discourage the perpetuation into a new generation of others deemed unfit, whether because of low intelligence, mental disorders, certain classes of chronic illness and disabilities, or criminal proclivities. Eugenicists proposed that by controlling human reproduction, humankind could take control of its own future. The eugenics agenda also suggested that much public health legislation encouraged the survival of those normally weeded out by natural selection. So it's very interesting here that he's using eugenics for public health, because of course the Nazi regime was based on apparently the Aryan race being the best and the extermination of those who weren't deemed to be worthy of survival, basically. But there he's saying, David Welch is saying quite openly that eugenics goes back to the 1860s. And it's quite interesting to see him framing it there as purely for public health. They also talk about the US Food Administration from 1917 urged families to reduce consumption of key staples to aid the war effort. Food will win the war, the government proclaimed, and Meatless Monday and Wheatless Wednesday were introduced to encourage Americans to do their part. One poster proclaimed, "Food will win the war. We observe meatless days, wheatless days, porkless days, and carry out all conservation rules of the US Food Administration." There's a bit of using food as a weapon, essentially, there. Now, there's a poster here from the Association of Maternity and Child Welfare Centre in London, advocating an enduring message of the importance of exercise in healthy child development. And there's a little rhyme here, a poem, if you like. It's accompanied by pictures of a toddler climbing and crawling. "If I'm to walk and run and shout, I must have room to roll about, for lungs and muscles stronger grow, with use, as all wise mothers know. Cradle and pram are meant for rest, for exercise the floor is best. Secured from drought, to stretch and squirm, will make my limbs well shaped and firm. Of clothing freed and at my ease, I'll scramble soon on hands and knees. One effort more, I'm certain quite, I'll find the way to stand upright." Now, another famous slogan is "Dig for Victory," and those of a certain vintage in England will surely know that. So there's a poster here, "Your own vegetables all the year round," and there's a nice picture of some fresh-looking vegetables. "If you dig for victory now." I guess that's positive propaganda, promoting the home production of fruit and vegetables. I suppose, yeah, it's propaganda in terms of using a tactic, but seems to be in a good cause there. There's another rhyme here. "Dig, dig, dig, and your muscles will grow big. Keep on pushing the spade. Don't mind the worms, just ignore their squirms. And when your back aches, laugh with glee, and keep on digging till we give our foes a wigging." You can tell this is written about 80 years ago. Dig, dig, dig to victory. Carrots were one vegetable in plentiful supply, and as a result widely became a substitute for the more scarce commodities. To improve their blandness, people were encouraged to enjoy the healthy carrot in different ways by the introduction of such characters as Dr. Carrot. The Ministry of Agriculture suggested such culinary delights as curried carrot, carrot jam, and a homemade drink called carolade. I'm not making this up. Made from the juices of carrots and swede. If anyone's ever had carolade, or indeed carrot jam, curried carrot, if you've had any of those, please write in and tell me how they taste. Potato Pete was another character introduced to encourage the population to eat homegrown vegetables. As with the Dig for Victory theme, Potato Pete also had his own song amplifying the message. For those in England of a certain age, here's a random fact for you. With vocals by Betty Driver, later Betty Williams, in the television soap opera Coronation Street. She was the one who used to make the hot pots in The Rover's Return and didn't seem to have any storylines ever. The recording was a great success and did a tremendous amount of good in getting the message across. There's a recipe book here for, among other things, scalloped potatoes, champ, pink and green puree. That doesn't sound too good. Potato basket. This all seems very quaint, doesn't it, in comparison to the war propaganda we've been looking at. They talk about the School Milk Act in England, which guaranteed free school milk to all pupils under the age of 18. The Milk Marketing Board had already been established way back in 1933 as a government agency to control milk production and distribution. Spurred on by the new act from the 1950s, there were several memorable advertising campaigns on which, incidentally, the COI and Milk Marketing Board collaborated. Slogans included, "Full of natural goodness, is your man getting enough?" Well, that's pretty risque for the 50s, isn't it? Milk's got a lot of bottle. If you don't know what bottle means, it means nerve or ability to perform under pressure. And drink a pint of milk a day. Margaret Thatcher was Education Secretary in 1971. She ended free school milk for the over sevens, which generated its own memorable slogan of protest, "Thatcher, Thatcher, milk snatcher." Now we go from healthy food and eating to smoking. which has always been an area of great fascination in terms of advertising and in terms of the sheer phenomenon of how many people used to smoke. And, you know, they obviously still do. Still a lot of people smoke in various countries. It's a majority of the adult population. Famously, I think it was in 1953, the health minister made an official announcement that a link had been found between smoking and lung cancer. And the legend, I'm not sure if this is true, is that he was actually smoking a cigarette when he was making that announcement. There's no video of that, so I can't verify that. If anyone knows if that's true, please tell me. Now, this is interesting. They talk about the Nazis here. Anti-smoking messages were disseminated to people in their workplaces, often with the enthusiastic help of the Hitler Youth, who acted as apostles for a healthy Nazi lifestyle. Well-known health magazines, such as, and I'm going to give you the English language translations, Healthy People, People's Health, and Healthy Life, published warnings about the health consequences of smoking. The main journal of the anti-tobacco movement was, and the translation is Clean Air, which carried dire warnings and pulled no punches in describing and revealing the harmful effects that tobacco had on human organs and tissues. In June 1939, an Office Against the Hazards of Alcohol and Tobacco was formed, and the Reich Office for the Struggle Against Intoxicating Drugs helped in the anti-tobacco campaign. The Nazis also established ambitious rumour registries, which included the first broad registries of cancer incidents, and not just cancer mortality. Now, it's interesting, a cartoon here, or a poster, of a man being consumed by a cigarette, and the cigarette has got a mouth with very, very sharp teeth. And the caption says, "The Chain Smoker, a Nazi anti-smoking advertisement from 1941. It promises that the smoker will be consumed by his habit. He does not devour it, it devours him. Smoking did not suit Nazi goals of working to perfect the Aryan body." Now, again, we need to talk about this. When you look at that and you think of it in the black and white terms of good and evil, they're bad, we're good, everything they do is bad, all their motives are bad, all our motives are good. And this book doesn't quite do that, but, you know, until we started nuancing our views on things, that was kind of the prevailing thing. We have now the problem of motives. So what is suggested here is that, okay, smoking doesn't suit the Nazi goals of working to perfect the Aryan body, which is related to eugenics, which David Welch has already admitted goes back to the 1860s. Remember also that the Nazis were known as the National Socialist. Nazi is in a sense, propagandistic word in itself, rather like Viet Cong, which is the North Vietnamese, who were originally called the Viet Minh. So Viet Cong was a derogatory term, but is the one that's always used now. Nazi, of course, sounds very similar to nasty. Just today, as I'm recording this, I've just recorded a podcast for Glass Onion about John Lennon, the actor, and we were talking about when he went on a TV show and recited his own poem, "I was bored on the 9th of October when the nasties were still booming us," meaning, of course, the Nazis were still bombing us. So the Nazis, or the government in Germany, wanted healthier citizens. Should we assume that's all for a bad reason? That's all for eugenics purposes. There couldn't possibly be any good in it. I want to make it clear, I'm not a sympathiser in that direction. The stereotype is that at least the trains run on time, meaning that these totalitarian regimes are often very well organised. But just to say that with anything, I always preach nuance and not too much binary black and white thinking. Certain media outlets, mainstream media outlets, or the mainstream media at large, everything is in sound bites, and as we've seen with propaganda, if you keep it simple and you continually promote as well works of art like Star Wars, for example, or anything else that has a pretty simple good and evil narrative, the public are reassured by that. But yes, I just encourage nuanced thinking. Also, I was on The Mind Renewed sometime last year. We did a review of the film Downfall, very, very good film. Again, I'll put it in the show notes. And that was a film that did not seek to excuse the Nazis, but it sought to humanise them. It gets very important. These are human beings. They're not computers. Although me personally, I grew up to think that Russians were like computers. And I was talking about this with somebody. when I was a kid in the 80s, all I really knew about Russia was Ivan Drago from Rocky IV. There's this idea that Russians and Germans, they don't have any heart. It's all to do with very regimented and systemized control. And that's a very, very crude stereotype. Talking of crude, I actually did find, it's not in this book, but this is amazing. I found online when I was researching propaganda, a US ad that was trying to promote car sharing. And the ad was someone in their car, and next to them in the passenger seat was Adolf Hitler. I think it was like a silhouette of Hitler. And the slogan of it was that if you drive alone, you're sharing with Hitler. Yes, quite amusingly random there. I suppose now it would be sharing with Trump, wouldn't it? Especially among liberals. Just this idea that this person is just totally evil. And of course there's a good argument for that with Hitler, but I don't know about with Trump. Yeah, just that idea that with certain people, if you're anywhere near them, I kind of found darkly amusing. Just carrying on with this, the Nazi drive to stop people smoking. Despite all of this, and they're talking about various other means they used for, let's call it propaganda, persuasion, whatever you want to call it, the early anti-smoking campaign was considered a failure. More than this, between 1933 and 1937, there was a rapid increase in tobacco consumption in Germany, largely because the cigarette manufacturing companies were constantly challenging the anti-tobacco campaign. The tobacco industry attempted to hinder the campaign to prevent women from smoking by countering government propaganda with advertisements that showed fashion models smoking as sexy and liberated. Indeed, despite government regulations, many women in Germany regularly smoked, including the wives of high-ranking Nazi officials such as Goebbels' wife Magda. Now, here's an interesting thing, and this name came up right at the beginning of this look at propaganda. Similar counter-propaganda was experienced in the United States. Edward Bernays, often referred to as the father of modern propaganda, I called him the father of public relations, so there you go, you see the link there, was engaged by the American Tobacco Company to work out a public relations strategy aimed at encouraging women to smoke. In the late 1920s, for example, they hired a group of young women to march down New York's Fifth Avenue in the Easter Parade, holding their, quote, torches of freedom, their cigarettes. Thus, cigarettes were portrayed as symbols of women's emancipation, rather than as cancer sticks, which is what they really are. Okay. Let's move on to road safety. What they do here, they're using cute animals and other symbols to encourage road safety. So, of course, road safety is one of those things that it's very hard to argue against. We are talking about positive persuasion / propaganda here. I'm just going to read the last paragraph of this section. Deaths from road traffic injuries have continued to fall in Britain. For example, in the 20 years between 1992 and 2002, down from 4,229 to 3,431. During the same period, the number of child pedestrians killed was more than halved, down from 180 to 79. Many factors have played their part, of course, including engineering improvements in vehicles and on highways, the wearing of seatbelts, and a raised consciousness of road safety procedures. But part of the mix is the propaganda, they put propaganda in inverted commas there, which I think you could use for this whole chapter, of the public information campaigns that continue to urge drivers not to drink and drive, and children to stop, look, listen, think. Now, they then talk about VD, which is venereal disease. They start talking about diseases and then AIDS. Between that, they mention the March of Dimes. And this is one of the most successful 20th century propaganda campaigns launched against polio in the United States. Although it was initiated by US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, it was not sponsored by the government, nor indeed by any governmental agency. In 1921, at the age of 39, Roosevelt contracted polio and became paralyzed from the waist down. For the rest of his life, he was committed to finding a way to rehabilitate himself, as well as others afflicted with the infantile paralysis that had been dubbed the crippler. In 1934, he began using the occasion of his birthday each year to encourage Americans to throw birthday balls to help raise funds, a ball is a party there, for his Georgia Warm Springs Foundation, which he had established in 1927 to facilitate polio rehabilitation. Radio personality Eddie Cantor took to the airwaves and urged Americans to send their loose change to President Roosevelt in a march of dimes to reach all the way to the White House. The name was later tagged onto the National Foundation's own title, effectively revitalizing that organization. So it's another example there of, it's quite a common thing of asking the public to contribute loose change, basically, towards a cause. There's a section all about vaccines, which of course has become quite topical and a big talking point in the last few years with the COVID vaccines. Mass media campaigns have shaped the debate about the maintenance of good health and the relationship between the state and citizenship, and have implied a contract of sorts, not unlike that between a doctor and his patient. While the state has provided scientific information and advocated behavioural change, the citizen has been expected to follow that advice uncritically. Now, just pause to say that that kind of contract was really in place also when we talked about war in a previous chapter. That contract has been used in various contexts. And again, it's trying to get rid of the them and us, of seeing the government and those with authority and real power as them and the ordinary citizens as us. So this contract, it's something to bind the normal citizens to their rulers, basically. Vaccines have both reinforced and tested this relationship. They have provided state authorities, both in developed and developing countries, as well as international organisations and charities, with a scientific rationale and legitimacy for greater intervention. However, in promoting and maintaining good health, can the state continue to expect an acquiescent public? Vaccines and vaccine research have raised serious ethical dilemmas in the past, in production and clinical experiments, and have led to public protest and sometimes resistance against medicine. In some countries, such as France and Germany, children are expected to furnish proof of vaccination before they can attend school. In other countries, the contract between the citizen and the state is less formal, and this has enabled counter-propaganda campaigns to challenge the advice provided by the state. Recent examples in the UK have concerned the MMR, cervical cancer and swine flu campaigns. The MMR vaccine is measles, mumps, rubella. It's a sort of 3-in-1 vaccine. As I mentioned just before, COVID, of course, has brought this very much into the spotlight. This book was written before COVID. The whole subject of public health, which has been defined as, quote, the science and art of preventing diseases, prolonging life, and preventing disability through the organised efforts of society, amply demonstrates the scale of propaganda campaigns in times of peace, not just in war. Governments have a responsibility for their citizens, and the media are the obvious means of conveying public health information. The methods can vary enormously, as we've seen, from shock tactics to humour, and the vehicles may be many, from matchboxes to music. Sometimes the state's motivations are more complex, darker than the mooted health benefits suggest, as we've seen in the Soviet and Nazi contexts. And sometimes groups of citizens and pressure groups, especially in the age of the internet and social networking, band together to resist the orthodoxies of public information. But by and large, it could be said that when it comes to public health, propaganda's pejorative associations tend to slip away. It's generally seen in a much more favourable light. And we can say, as we said at the beginning of this chapter, is it then propaganda? I'll leave that with you, folks. Right, chapter 5, case studies in negative propaganda. This is another one I'm going to not exactly skim through, but talk about less than some of the earlier chapters. I'm not going to go in detail through the case studies. I'm mostly just actually going to highlight some of the different names and the ways of demonisation that have been used by all sides, really, and countries. I should just mention, there's quite an incredible poster here, Demonising the Enemy. In this white Russian poster issued by the Southern armies during the Russian Civil War, 1918 to 1921, leading Bolsheviks, including Lennon, Trotsky, Zinoviev and others, are driven into hell and its array of tortures by white guardsmen and an avenging angel. And this is a very, very devilish poster, literally. Quite intense, really, for that time, when we think of posters as being a bit more innocent then. So let's go through some of these labels. So you've got the avaricious French. When France and Britain put recent colonial disputes to one side at the turn of the 19th century, this signalled a rapprochement overturning years of mutual suspicion, sometimes hatred. In 1994, this new era was expressed in the signing of a historic agreement, and the Entente Cordiale was born. In earlier times, when not clashing on the battlefield, they were trading insults and name-calling, with the French transformed into frogs and the English into rosbifs. Now, there's a fantastic poster on the next page, and the caption says, "The Entente Cordiale, under a little 21st century strain," in a cartoon by Chris Riddell, published in The Observer. It's a brilliant cartoon of Tony Blair and Jacques Chirac, the respective leaders of Britain and France, hugging but then stabbing each other in the back. And Blair, as usual, has got these enormous ears. He's always portrayed that way. Tony Blair and Jacques Chirac hug in amity as they attack each other's presumed economic stance and stab each other in the back. There's various poems here. One of them is on France's humiliation. There's this long-standing stereotype that French are cowards. That's one of the things in English culture, let's call it. French culinary habits as well, including their eating habits. Later on, we got the Hun and the Prussian bully. So I'm just going to read a little bit here. It was during the First World War that the German enemy came to be derogatorily called the Hun. The original Huns were actually Mongols from Central Asia who spread into Europe in the 4th century AD and who became popularly linked with ideas of barbarian invasion and destruction. But by 1914, British soldiers and civilians alike were familiar with the destructive associations of the Hun in a more immediate context, an association fueled by a relentless and potent propaganda campaign that was able to exploit the fact that the Germans had laid waste places of cultural significance. The association of the Hun with contemporary Germans persisted throughout the war, with Kaiser Wilhelm II sometimes portrayed as Attila the Hun. Now, just a couple of things to say there. Hun, of course, is another word with a certain energy. It's short, and it's quite a punchy word. This is not the first time that a word has been used in association with a totally different group of people. So yeah, originally it was related to the Mongols. Really, they're suggesting there, and this is even during the First World War, that if you just say something enough and you push hard enough with your propaganda, that it eventually get through, even if it's fairly false, really. Now, Donald Trump has been a master of derogatory nicknames to some of his political rivals, such as calling Ted Cruz Lying Ted and Hillary Clinton Crooked Hillary. You know, he understands that simple and punchy is the way to go. They mention here the German invasion of neutral Belgium, I think it was in 1914, was a pretext for an anti-German campaign that rapidly mobilised widespread support among all sections of the British population. Belgium was depicted as a defenceless child or woman ravaged by brutal Prussian militarism. In fact, a term that had only been applied since the turn of the century. One of the most famous cartoons of the First World War, Bravo Belgium, was published by Punch on 12th of August 1914. And here, as we've said, a valiant Belgian boy stands firm against the advancing Prussian bully who is replete with sausages to reinforce the stereotype. Yeah, so you've got here a bully smoking a pipe and with a big club, as he said, with sausages trailing in his wake. The violation of the neutral Belgians played a large role in the British rationale for war. Yeah, there are all kinds of stories that came out about that. Kind of the usual stuff about bayoneting babies and things like that. I don't mean to sound flippant, but I've seen this so much through the years. This always happens. You think of the worst possible thing, and in fact, related to the October 7th attack last year, a lot of those, if you actually look at what's been proved and disproved, they've dialed back a lot of the claims. Again, I'm not defending the attack there, but I would say just try not to get carried away by shock tactics. Shocking things happen in the world, no doubt, but a lot is often made of them, and they are used propagandistically, with great exaggerations. I'm not sure exactly about this invasion of Belgium, whether some of the worst excesses were disproved. I'm not totally sure about that, but I've heard various people talking about it. There's a David and Goliath aspect, of course, to this poster I'm talking about. Again, that's nice and simple, the little man and the big bully. There's another poster called The Prussian Butcher, And this time there's a chopping block, and there's the Hun with a spiked helmet brandishing a knife, and the woman who is on the chopping block here is Mercy. It's Mercy that's on the chopping block, about to be dismembered by the bestial Hun. It's quite another pretty shocking poster there. She's got angel's wings as well, Mercy. Once again, there's a lot of creativity involved in this. Propaganda is certainly an art form. Now, just going back to the Belgian invasion, British propaganda, and in particular the press, disseminated many tales of brutalised Belgian refugees, violated nuns, babies with hands cut off, corpses boiled to make soap, priests used as clappers in church bells, and so forth. Edmund Sullivan's horrific cartoons were in a similar style to those of the Dutch cartoonist Louis Raymakers. Hope I said that right. Sullivan's wartime images caricatured Germans as bloated, half-human militaristic monsters and dramatised their alleged atrocities. So he's saying alleged atrocities there. Violated nuns, babies with hands cut off. I'm sure that does happen in the world, but it's whether all those things happened in this invasion of Belgium. Belgium is, of course, a small country as well, and as we said, what was played up was the fact that they were neutral and they'd still been invaded. Now we move on to another slogan, let's say the greedy kulaks. If the Hun provided a good example of denunciation of an enemy without, which kind of means from the outside, the derogatory Russian term kulak denoted a very distinct type of enemy within, engaged in wrecking the Marxist-Leninist project. Kulaks were former peasants who owned medium-sized farms as a result of the reforms introduced by the Tsarist Prime Minister Peter Stolypin in 1906. Soviet propaganda painted these farmers as greedy and standing in the way of the utopian collectivization because it would take away their land, livestock and produce. The Bolsheviks declared them enemies of the people, and kulaks were left homeless and even without a single possession, as everything was taken from them, including their pots and pans. It was also forbidden by law for anyone to aid dispossessed kulak families. Just to give you the very short version, the idea was that the communist regime were against property, which included grain. So all farmers were forced to hand over their grain to the state, which caused mass starvations. Absolute horror story. The rationale behind forced collectivization was that peasant smallholdings should merge to form large collective farms. So it's this dream of collectivization that led to extremely dark outcomes. To achieve this, Stalin believed he had to obliterate the kulak class, some of whom responded to the changes by destroying crops, livestock and property rather than allow the state to take them. In order, therefore, to liquidate the kulaks, Stalin sought the support of the poorer peasants. He embarked on a concerted propaganda campaign that targeted the kulaks and blackened them as bourgeois small capitalists who should be eliminated to allow the collectivization of agriculture. Kulaks as a class were depicted as the enemy within, together with other traditional counter-revolutionaries such as capitalists and priests. There's a poster here and the caption says, "A fat and implicitly greedy, selfish kulak is forced from the collective farm in this unambiguously hostile poster from the Soviet campaign against kulaks." The text reads, "Down with the kulaks, kick the kulaks out of the..." And there's a Russian word which means collective farm. To the right of the large fist is a quotation attributed to Lennon. "The kulaks are most bestial, brutal and savage exploiters who in the history of other countries have time and again restored the power of the landlords, czars, priests and capitalists." Right, we move from the kulaks to the, quote, Teutonic Nazis. I think Teutonic is still used as a code word for German, but I don't know if you know this, but this actually goes back. I'll explain a bit more in a minute. I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs. In 1938, when Nazi foreign policy was increasingly expansionist, Sergei Eisenstein, the filmmaker, produced the historical film epic Alexander Nevsky. The film was an allegory, a projection of present events onto the past, and appealed to the example offered by Russian history. The story of this prince's legendary victory in 1242 over the Teutonic Knights, who were rampaging through what was now Russian territory, today Estonia, clearly implied that Germans could not be relied upon to uphold peace treaties. The film was intended to arouse patriotic sentiment against the Nazi threat by emphasizing the despicable nature of the enemy, and Nevsky symbolized the spirit of Russia and its historical resistance to foreign invaders. When Soviet policy changed abruptly in 1939 with the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, Stalin banned the film, but it was re-released in 1941 after the Nazi invasion. So yeah, the Nazis and communists were enemies. Then they became friends for 2 years, but then the Nazis invaded, or the Germans invaded. So yeah, these Teutonic Knights, that's, as we said, 1242, so that's many, many centuries before. And this tag was attached to the Nazis and presumably stuck. There's also reference to the beastly German, so we've got some beast imagery then. We've heard the word bestial and beastly already. Some people may have heard of Noel Coward, the playwright and a songwriter, and he made a parody song. So we've already seen poems, now we're seeing songs. And I think parody is very effective in propaganda because it can use humour, which is a potent weapon in many contexts. Again, just to talk about advertising, humour is used in advertising as well. I think I mentioned in one of the other parts how Triumph of the Will had been re-edited to lampoon Hitler. I'm not sure if I've already mentioned this, but The Great Dictator, the Charlie Chaplin film, it is mentioned in the book. I think Chaplin is mentioned in the book, but not that film necessarily. So with reference to lampooning Hitler, the reduction of a frightening enemy to the level of visibility and ridicule is, in psychological terms, a means of achieving power over him. The British used a similar technique to undermine and humiliate Mussolini. For example, Alberto Cavalcanti's 1940 documentary film Yellow Caesar was a highly effective piece of propaganda which reinforced the impression of Mussolini as a clown. Yes, we should mention really that if you look at Hitler and Mussolini in particular, they were just ripe for parody. You know, Hitler with that ridiculous moustache and some of the way he moved and the way he taught. And then Mussolini was obviously short and rotund. It's probably a polite word for it. There's a section also on the demonization of the Japanese with what we would now call very offensive posters and parodies. They then talk about the effete English, and effete sort of means weak and without much power, slightly feminine perhaps. I actually used national stereotypes in some of my English classes, and it's a very interesting thing, and it can be quite funny, you know, if it's taken in the right heart. I mean, I remember teaching in London, and I had a group of, I think, 6 or 7 nationalities in the same group, and they were absolutely rolling around laughing at stereotypes of each other's countries. But of course, when you're talking about very serious things like war, then it's not quite as funny, you know. Throughout the early part of the summer of 1940, as a struggle for control of the skies above Britain took place, anti-British propaganda reached a new crescendo, claiming that it was only a matter of time before Britain's fate was sealed. Propaganda emphasised British hypocrisy and plutocracy. Churchill in particular was targeted and mercilessly lampooned. One famous poster depicted him as an American-style gangster, the Sniper, brandishing a machine gun. The secret police reports suggested that German hatred of Britain, incited by incessant propaganda, was now widespread. Churchill, of course, is another one. The big cigar, his way of talking, that's very ripe for parody. And then finally in this chapter we get the Jewish rats, the association of Jews with rats. The constant analogy made with rats and parasites suggested that the Jew differed from the Aryan not only in body, but more significantly in soul, for the Jew had no soul. The implication was that here was a menace that had to be resisted. Thus the conclusion to be drawn from watching propaganda films was that the killing of Jews was not a crime but a necessity. Jews, after all, were not human beings but pests, which had to be exterminated. One of the films, and I'm not going to try and pronounce its name, represents a form of National Socialist realism depicting not so much what was, but what ought to have been, in accordance with the preconceived notion of Nazi racial ideology. Having previewed the film before its release, Goebbels recorded in his diary, "The scenes so horrific and brutal in their explicitness that one's blood runs cold. One shudders at such barbarism. This Jewry must be eliminated." Now, on the subject of rats, some of you may remember in, I think it was 2000, when George W. Bush was running in the American election with Al Gore. The Bush campaign ran an ad which said, bureaucrats decide, and it had a picture of Al Gore. But what they did was, when the slogan came up on the screen, bureaucrats, just for for a split second, I should say, the rats part at the end of the word bureaucrats was highlighted just a millisecond before the actual whole slogan came up on the screen. There was a thing also that was done, once again, we're talking about advertising. I think this was verified, that in the cinema, Coca-Cola used to flash images of Coke so fast that nobody could consciously detect them. But apparently sales of Coca-Cola did go up in cinemas. So that's, that is an effective tool. Once again, it's how it's used. Some would say even increasing the sales of Coke is not a great thing because Coke is not really a healthy drink. But obviously compared to other ways that it could be used, that's reasonably innocuous. But we're really getting this pattern here, aren't we? Often it's the way that something is used, not the thing itself. They make reference to the Rwandan genocide and just the idea of Tutsis as traitors by their enemies, the Hutus. And again, it's this idea of tagging a word like traitor onto a race or a side of a war. A bit closer to home for me, the idea of Irish men of violence, where the British portray themselves as saving Ireland from itself. That is from the two warring sectarian factions, the nationalists and the loyalists. This period was known as the Troubles in Ireland. I'll just read a little bit of this. The Troubles, of course, represented a different type of struggle to that in Vietnam, both from the military security perspective and from the point of view of the propaganda war. Not only were British troops being deployed on what was officially home soil in lower intensity security operations, but their opponents were also dressed as civilians. British propaganda sought to explain the military presence in terms of protecting Northern Ireland from itself, from these two warring factions, as I said. It also emphasised the association of terrorism with the activities of the IRA, that's the Irish Republican Army. However, the government underestimated the effectiveness of IRA counter-propaganda. The sight of heavily armed British troops confronting stone-throwing children in the streets of Belfast night after night on news bulletins throughout the world was a public relations disaster, especially in the American cities with large expatriate Irish populations. So yes, a lot of Americans who have Irish heritage, they seem to be quite proud of it, so they had a bit of a dog in this particular fight. The British government sought initially to treat the Troubles as a domestic problem which concerned no one else, but the situation came to be viewed by many critics as a cancer that eroded freedoms and exposed the hollowness of British claims to be championing democracy. The introduction of internment and trial without jury in 1973 under the Emergency Powers Act only served to reinforce such views, both in Britain and around the world. The long-running conflict in Northern Ireland served to demonstrate a principle that is now well established, namely that democracies cannot fight terrorism on their own terms. The terrorist bomber invariably holds the advantage, and in the age of the mass media, thrives on publicity. Now, just one final thing at the end of this chapter. It's important to remember that the images of the enemy we have seen were not constructed in isolation. The film, the poster, the leaflet, the cartoon, the radio or television broadcast, and now the internet footage would not have been viewed in a vacuum. They each formed only one aspect of a wider and concerted propaganda drive, in which all the available means of communication were generally employed. The case studies chosen are historical, and for the most part the stereotypes are of their time and have since withered, if not necessarily died. Today, many people may wonder how audiences in the past could be so gullible in accepting and acting on such propaganda, but the principle is timeless, and the construction of enemies, both real and imagined, is perennial. Well, yes, interesting point he makes there, because maybe in the future people will look back on now and say, how did we fall for that propaganda? I think I would agree that people are wising up. We are becoming healthily sceptical, some would say cynical, about the authorities and the ways they try to persuade us to do certain things or to have certain attitudes. Right. I feel like we're actually on the home stretch now, folks. Famous last words. The final chapter is Propaganda in the 21st Century. I really wanted to mostly focus on the 20th century, which was earlier called the century of propaganda. But we are going to bring it now to the present day. In the 20th century, the advent of total war changed forever the relationship between the media, old-style diplomacy, and the need for secrecy. The new media had the power to shape public opinion, a power that gave politicians reason to fear them. Later on, the changing nature of international crises, when the Cold War gave way to a post-Cold War environment, together with rapidly changing technology, transformed the nature of warfare and its reportage. The colossal impact of 9/11, in which a handful of dedicated zealots found means to inflict such damage on a superpower, highlighted a new term in the vocabulary of conflict: asymmetrical warfare. Defined as the means by which a weaker nation or group attempts to offset deficiencies in the quality and quantity of military resources by resorting to resilience and terror tactics, asymmetry has exerted a profound hold on early 21st century thinking. An asymmetrical war, yes, is when two sides are fighting who are in no way equal in terms of their resources and size of fighting forces. Now, they talk about the First Gulf War, which we've already covered to some extent, revealing the Iraq War, sometimes called the Second Gulf War in 2003, continued where Operation Desert Storm, that was in the original Iraq War in the early 90s, left off in terms of PSYOPs, that's psychological operations. The United States employed its long tradition of radio PSYOPs, which could be traced back to Vietnam. Broadcasts were used in Afghanistan after 9/11 to persuade citizens to reveal Taliban and Al-Qaeda factions. In the Iraq War, the United States engaged in a comprehensive airwaves campaign to soften its enemy and soothe its population at home. Spearheading the electronic propaganda campaign were converted C-130 US cargo planes from the Commando Solo fleet, transmitting a mixture of Arabic and Western music and spoken announcements to the troops and citizens of Iraq, urging them not to fight and explaining how to surrender. I do just want to briefly comment on the Iraq War. It's absolutely breathtaking to me how that has been allowed to fade into history, and I don't believe anyone has been held culpable for the American side of it. George Bush is now, an eccentric old man who does quite weird artwork, and of course he wrote his book. I can't even remember the title. I don't even want to know. If you want a devastating documentary, but I mean devastating I'm saying in terms of the information, but very, very accessible, Roger Stoll, who I mentioned earlier, who directed Theatres of War, he also, quite a number of years ago, created a documentary called Militainment Inc. Last time I checked, there was a very, very poor quality version on YouTube, but I'll put it in the show notes anyway, maybe just even the IMDb page, but if you can seek that out, I mean, it's incredible, really, and just breathtaking how the media were just lockstep with promoting that war. An honourable mention, of course, was Phil Donahue, who expressed doubts about the war and promptly lost his job very quickly. Now, they make mention of embedding reporters. I think that came up in an earlier chapter. I'm sure we talked about that. The multitude of news channels beaming constant images attracted two different types of criticism. Some critics suggested that 24-hour news channels amounted to little more than purveyors of war porn for the manner in which they broadcast relentless images without context or explanation. And I did mention earlier when we were talking about this in one of the other parts, what Bill Hicks called the boners they had about the weapons. They were just gushing about these amazing weapons. Other critics feared that too much reality could have serious effects on morale. To put such fears in historical context, we might wonder how long the governments of Asquith and Lloyd George could have maintained the British war effort had the public been able to see live coverage of the Somme in 1916. That's one of the most famous battles of World War I. In the subsequent war, would it have been possible to evacuate 300,000 troops from Dunkirk under the scrutiny of 24-hour rolling news? So 24-hour rolling news, like many other things, can be a force for good if it highlights the right things. But if it's just, as I said, a constant rolling news without any context and with this simple good and evil narrative, then it's not a good thing. In international affairs, the 21st century, for the United States in particular, has been dominated by that one phrase, war on terror. It was a term with serious and not always expected or helpful implications. Following the 9/11 attacks, the US administration of George W. Bush justified its military response by announcing the global war on terror, arguing that it had the right and ability to pursue al-Qaeda and any state or group that harboured them and their leader, Osama bin Laden. By declaring a global war on terror, the West invoked Article 51 of the UN Charter, the right to self-defence. How about that? And in the process empowered the terrorists with the status of warriors, lending them an aura of legitimacy, something that groups such as al-Qaeda went on to shrewdly exploit in their own counter-propaganda against the West. If you want to know more about al-Qaeda, I recommend Adam Curtis's film The Power of Nightmares. I've got quite major issues with Adam Curtis generally, but that's a good one. And also look up Mujahideen. That might tell you something about these supposed terrorists and their relationship with the West. The decision to extend the war from Afghanistan to Iraq represented a major propaganda error, leaving aside the moral and strategic arguments on the part of the Bush administration. Following the 9/11 attacks, the United States had an opportunity to tap into the groundswell of supportive world opinion, as exemplified by Le Monde's famous front page, "We are all Americans now." That's a French newspaper, obviously. I say obviously, Le Monde, the world, basic French. But the erroneous claims that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and had links with jihadist groups, followed by the American-led invasion, offered support to the al-Qaeda narrative of Western aims, not liberators intent on bringing democracy, but invaders intent on occupying and destroying the Muslim world. And believe me, they're not the only ones who think that. Of course, one of the other things was the connection that was made, and this is a good example of just relentless propaganda, the link that was made between Iraq and 9/11. And there's a famous clip of George Bush actually admitting, what's Iraq got to do in 9/11? Nothing. George Bush had I'd say his only quality really was a slight childlike, naive innocence in some of the statements he made, because he was clearly a puppet being controlled by Cheney and Rumsfeld and the neocons, Wolfowitz, all that mob. And sometimes, he just was almost like a little bit too innocent. Just going on, part of the problem lay in a widespread absence in the United States of serious debate about the war and the reasons for war. In the post-9/11 atmosphere, the public was generally underinformed about the circumstances of Iraq, and the media did not initiate debate. There was a sense in which it was deemed unpatriotic to question or scrutinise. Where have you seen that before? Basically all through the 20th century. The cudgel of patriotism prevented the healthy dynamism needed in democracy between political leaders and the public. The great failing of US media coverage of the Iraq War was accordingly its complicity. By contrast, the build-up to war incited strong and divided feelings in Britain and in much of Europe. I could definitely attest to that. Now just one more paragraph on Iraq. As US forces took hold of Baghdad, the toppling of the statue of Saddam Hussein was intended to be a symbolic act that represented the swift conclusion to a campaign of shock and awe, a phrase at odds with the slogan "Enduring Freedom." Now, two things there. The toppling of the statue, simple and symbolic. And again, shock and awe was supposed to finish quickly. Remember we saw that back in the First World War? Just under 100 years earlier. It mimicked those famous symbolic moments of victory from the Second World War, the stars and stripes planted on Iwo Jima, and the red flag unfolded from the smouldering Reichstag in Berlin. It was depicted in the Western media as widely celebrated by frenzied Iraqis, beating the statue with their shoes to show their contempt for Saddam. Yet in retrospect, we know that it was largely constructed and editorialized by the US military. In total, the images and the accompanying rhetoric suggested that a short war was over, whereas the truth was that a long war was only just beginning. I think also, wasn't there a thing where someone showed a wider shot and you saw a load of Iraqis celebrating and then saw that it was about 20 people and there was nothing behind them in the shot? I'm pretty sure it was that one. Now they carry on, they do talk about the Arab Spring as well, but I'm going to leave it at Iraq. I have been engaged in politics since then, but that was around the period, probably up to a bit later, maybe 2007 or 8, where I was fairly engaged with politics. I mean, I still follow the news and I still follow interesting news stories, and I listen to podcasts which offer very, very deep dives into certain topics, such as Ukraine. But as you'll probably appreciate from this series that I'm just finishing now on propaganda, patterns repeat. And like I said, I do follow the news, but I suppose if I'm being honest, I was somewhat beaten down by how elusive the truth is and how much more elusive it's getting. They do make an interesting point here. Access to the means of communication through the internet and other social networks changes the dynamics of the propaganda war. The internet has provided terrorists with a vast ethereal recruitment arena. Internet chat rooms are supplementing and replacing mosques, community centres and coffee shops. Of course, hand in hand with that, the internet has also provided all of us with lots of information. Yes, the truth, as I said, is becoming more and more elusive, but there's also a whole world of information out there, and a lot of it is verified information. They're talking there about recruiting through the internet. Of course, a lot of activist groups use the internet and social media as well. So this idea of is the internet good or bad, that's something that without a yes or no answer. But let me try and leave you. I am going to read a little bit more from the book, but I wanted to say that the internet does provide a massive educational tool if you look in the right places. And you can generally find, with a bit of practice and a bit of dedication, where good information is to be found. Like I say, a lot of it is verified information, some of it is unverified. But I think a commitment to learning is a very noble quest. Just trying to accumulate knowledge, trying to separate the wheat from the chaff as best we can, while realising the limitations of that pursuit. Right, the final bit of the book I'm going to read here, just short sections. One of them is called Are We All Propagandists Now? In the White House and other organs of governments, there now exist teams whose sole responsibility is to monitor the world according to social media. Thus, the traditional flow of information from news providers to the reading, listening, viewing public has been inverted. So is real power shifting from a judicious mainstream to the texting mob? In some ways, there is purity in such a virtual democracy. It reflects the public mood in real time. It is difficult to rig, and sometimes truth is flushed out. However, politics by Facebook rarely adds up to considered rational debate. It is a visceral communal response, and governments are becoming extremely scared by it. Old-fashioned focus groups in a room appear irrelevant against thousands of tweeters suddenly getting angry about something. With politics conducted on social media sites and with no judicious rules appearing to operate, it's almost inevitable that standards and values that underpin civilized behaviour in the real world do not always apply. It's now possible to Google any accusations made against individuals, governments and companies without the need to verify the facts. And of course there's still this idea that, any conspiracy theory is unverified. But I think the public is seriously wising up to that. And I hope in my own small way I've helped people to at least cut through this total stereotyping of people who want to read into information and not take the surface level interpretation. I'm still guilty of waking up to news bulletins with just 5 or 6 cherry-picked facts, but I don't believe it, you see. Or if they tell me that what it's been recently is, Israel is attacking on 3 fronts now, and the same news headline seems to be X amount of people were killed, including hospital workers, aid workers, women, children. Then they'll say Israel claimed to be targeting Hamas leaders, Hezbollah leaders, Iranian leaders. And so what I garner from that is just the fact that this strike has happened. Now, everything beyond that, and then when you get all these experts and commentators, I just take that with a massive pinch of salt. So I take the facts of the news, and as I said, I do look into stories of interest. Notice they're called news stories. Language tells you a lot if you really look into it, folks. Now, the last section is called Hearts and Minds, the Enduring Goals. Hearts and Minds is a phrase apparently first used by a French general in 1895. I'm not going to read the very last part because that almost feels like it's going to put you off the book if you know the actual last paragraph. I'm just going to read a few paragraphs here. Arguably, propaganda is most effective when it is less noticeable. In a totalitarian regime, indeed in any closed society, propaganda is more obvious and visible and largely tolerated for fear of the consequences. In a so-called open society, propaganda is much more problematic when it is hidden and integrated into the political culture. Once it is exposed, people can feel duped and betrayed, and this serves only to reinforce the pejorative associations with the practice of propaganda, deemed to be at odds with that open society. Too often, effective propaganda is associated with the control of the flow of information and with duplicity and falsehood. There's another couple of words we can add to our propaganda synonyms. But propaganda has the potential to serve a constructive purpose. Writing in 1928, Edward Bernays, who did so much to frame the nature of modern advertising, argued that, quote, propaganda will never die out. Intelligent men must realize that propaganda is the modern instrument by which they can fight for productive ends and help to bring order out of chaos. It is perfectly possible to argue that in democracies, politics has nothing to fear from propaganda. Propaganda is merely a process of persuasion that forms a normal part of the political dynamic, and as such it could be argued that we need more propaganda, not less. So there you have it. Propaganda is ethically neutral. It can be good or bad. Citizens have to be more informed and arm themselves with a general understanding of the nature and processes of the information age. There's a couple more paragraphs, but I'm going to end it there, folks. And interesting there, we've ended with Edward Bernays, because he was mentioned right at the beginning. He wrote a book called Propaganda in 1928, and that was what they were quoting from. So perhaps not surprisingly, he was arguing for more propaganda. And that is it, my friends. Quite a journey. I've done this over 3 sessions, and it will be 3 parts. I'm sitting here at the end of October, but this will actually be the last episode of Life and Life Only to go out this year. What I'm going to do now, first of all, recommend the book, Propaganda, Power and Persuasion by David Welch. If you'd like to support the show, there are links in the show notes to PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. Any donations are gratefully accepted. Otherwise, please just share links and tell people about the show. It's been another good year of Life and Life Only. I've kept on roughly a monthly schedule. This is not a large audience. I'm not going to pretend it is. My audience for Glass Onion on John Lennon is much larger. But I think those of you who do follow the show, and I know there's plenty of you that listen to every show, I really do appreciate it. And I think it tells me something about you, that you are interested in looking beyond the familiar narratives. Life and Life Only is, as you know, a search for inner and outer truth. And as I said at the onset of these 3 episodes about propaganda, this has been mostly outer truth, but the inner truth side is to do with you being bulletproof, to see propaganda for what it is, good and bad, to see information for what it is, largely neutral. Obviously there's information about terrible acts that happen in the world. That's not neutral, but I'm saying that the information is there. We are drowning in a sea of it. But as I said, with a bit of practice, you can separate the good and the bad. And let's all say for 2025, let's all commit ourselves to learning and to thinking for ourselves and to not making snap judgments about things. And with all that being said, I suppose I should, on the 27th of October, wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Last year, I did this on something like the 25th or 6th of September, which was really ridiculous. This is slightly less ridiculous because, you know, Christmas is on its way pretty quickly. There's already Christmas posters and advertising, dare I say propaganda. Let's say advertising for now. It's coming soon, but you will be listening to this sometime around Christmas. So I'm just going to say, as I do every year, just have a nice Christmas and try and be with your family and try and foster good relationships with your family, because you'll miss them when they're gone. With all that said, so Merry Christmas to everybody, and I will see you in 2025. For now, take care of yourselves in this crazy world and take care of the people you love. So all the best. See you soon. Goodbye.
So I'm from the States, as you can tell by my complete lack of sophistication, but that's okay. Because I've greased my hair and I'm a little dark poet. That's who I am. And we had this big war thing happen. I don't know if you caught any of that, but first of all, this needs to be said. There never was a war. How can you say that, Bill? Well, a war is when two armies are fighting. So you see, right there, I think we can all agree it wasn't exactly a war. And President Bush, a complete surprise, he turned into a demon, man. When he was first president, they called him the wimp president. I mean, this was the cover of Newsweek. Apparently, this stuck in this guy's craw. Guy turned into a fucking demon, man. We surrender. Not good enough. We run away. Too little, too late. We're having way too much fun. Those guys were in hog heaven out there. You understand, man? They had a big weapons catalog opened up. What's G12 do, Tommy? Well, it says here it destroys everything but the fillings in their teeth. Helps us pay for the war effort. Well, shit, pull that one up. Pull up G12, please. Cool. What's G13 do? Weapons for all occasions. And everyone got excited about the technology. And I guess it was pretty incredible watching a missile fly down an air vent. Pretty unbelievable. But couldn't we feasibly use that same technology to shoot food at hungry people? You know what I mean? Fly over Ethiopia. There's a guy that needs a banana. The stealth banana. Smart fruit. And I watched the Iraqian technology. Man, I've never felt so good about myself. I look at fucking bell bottoms in my closet and go, that ain't that fucking bad, man. Don't you think one of the key prerequisites of a weapons system is, I don't know, the ability to aim the fucking thing? Or is that, I don't know a lot about the military, and yet I feel that would be key. I guess the most amazing thing about the war, obviously the disparity in the casualties. Iraq, 150,000 casualties. USA, 79. Let's go through those numbers again. They're a little baffling at first glance. Iraq, 150,000. USA, 79. 79. Does that mean if we had sent over 80 guys, we still would have won that fucking thing, or what? Just one guy in a ticker tape parade. I did it, hey. People said, Bill, Iraq had the 4th largest army in the world. Yeah, well, maybe. But you know what? After the first 3 largest armies, there's a real big fucking drop-off, okay? The Hare Krishnas are the 5th largest army in the world. And they've already got our airports. So, who is the greater threat? People that bugged me in the States, people said, hey, war made us feel better about ourselves. Who are these people with such low self-esteem? They need a war to feel better about themselves. I saw them on the news waving their flags. Could I recommend, instead of a war to feel better about yourself, perhaps sit-ups? Maybe a fruit cup? 6 to 8 glasses of water a day. I'm not telling you how to live. I'm just recommending perhaps a better way to feel better about yourself. And we can avoid a conflagration.